Is our webinar. It's 12:15, so we're going to start, and we are going to make every effort to finish by 1 o'clock with the formal presentation. If there are a lot of questions and answers, we can answer them at the end, but you're welcome to stay or leave at 1 o'clock. So today we're going to be talking about environmental liability insurance and environmental site investigations. Carl and I have been heavily involved in this space for combined over 50 years, and we see brownfield sites as a definite opportunity, contaminated sites, brownfield sites, and I compare it to, and I'm trying to explain it to people that are not in this space, it's similar to those home fix-it-up shows that you see on some of those channels where someone buys a fixer-upper, fixes it up, and then sells it at a profit. And similarly, if you buy contaminated property or brownfield site, you know, at a bargain basement price, and then you clean it up, develop it, it can be a tidy profit to you. So we're going to be talking about that as advertised. We're going to be talking about 4 things. So these are the topics of discussion. We're going to stay on topic. So the first item of business is the challenges and opportunities related to the development of contaminated sites and brownfield properties. As we may all know, the major real estate driver is location. The first 3 you've always been told is location, location, location. And there's certainly great opportunities throughout Toronto and other municipalities with respect to location, but also that location coincidentally corresponds with brownfield sites. And I have a picture in this particular slide of southern portion of Toronto, or main part of Toronto. Circle is New Toronto, which is fairly heavily industrialized still, but there's definitely lots of brownfield opportunities in this space. I was talking to a real estate developer and also a real estate agent in that space, and they generally agree, yeah, great location, lots of opportunity, but also the challenge of a brownfield site. So that tends to be the barrier that you're looking at, that, hey, it's a great location, but it's contaminated, so certain buyers certainly aren't interested in buying it. I'm going to hand over the microphone to Carl, who's going to give an example of a particular site with regards to the challenges and opportunities to that site.
Thanks, John. So why don't we just dive right into the deep end here, and we'll discuss a specific site that we worked on approximately 6 to 8 months ago now. So this is a contaminated property that a vendor put up for sale, and this is a snapshot of how that site was actually advertised. So basically the vendor came forward and said, look, it's a contaminated property, it's in the Greater Toronto area, and basically they distilled the issues with the site down to these 3 areas of impact. So a former underground storage tank and related pump island, some petroleum hydrocarbons associated with that, a volatile organic compound plume, and then some fill impacts on the property. And again, as I mentioned before, this is really how the site was marketed to potential buyers. And so one of the things that you might want to do as you're looking at a property like this is then drill down more into the actual deal. And as we did that, came to learn that this is really probably a classic example. So this is a site that has a 80+ year industrial history, and the vendor was actually the manufacturer who operated on this site during that period of time. And what they came to understand was they no longer needed the footprint that they originally constructed, and were very interested in entering into a sale leaseback transaction. So hoping to find a buyer, repurpose the site, but still give them a smaller building that they can continue to operate out of. They provided phase 1 environmental site assessment, made that available, and that assessment basically just aligned with what vendor is representing in terms of identifying these three areas of potential impact. So, next, so if you're a potential purchaser and you're seeing an opportunity like that come across, as an underwriter, these are things that we certainly suggest people consider. But again, as a potential buyer, you may have your own list. But at a minimum, you want to start thinking about things like, is that phase one environmental site assessment that's being provided by a vendor, is that appropriate? Is it sufficient from a risk management perspective? You'll also have to make your own opinions around what level of characterization is sufficient if you're not comfortable with that vendor's report. And then as you start negotiating the deal, there's other elements. So what sorts of terms and conditions do you want to see in a purchase and sale agreement? On this particular deal, what types of conditions do you want to see on a lease? So again, these are all just elements that you need to consider as you're going through the deal. And then again, as a future owner and redeveloper, you'll have to decide for yourself, are you comfortable using something like a risk assessment to help you with redevelopment? Or will you go more with a generic cleanup, basically a dig and dump type solution? And then most recently, in the last year or so, with the ministry becoming a little more active in the news, two things that you absolutely want or need to be considering in today's environment. One is the off-site migration of contaminants. And a simple Google search of something called Hamilton Beach will lead you to a recent case here in Ontario where a current tenant was actually held liable for contaminants migrating off their site by the Ministry of the Environment. So it just highlights the importance of understanding at least what's migrating off the property that you're considering buying. And then the other piece is off-site sources of contamination that might be impacting your property. So again, here what we're talking about is the liability that attaches to an entity simply because of the fact that contamination is flowing through your property. And the example there to look up would be Kawartha Lakes, where the Ministry of the Environment again asked a municipality to deal with contamination that wasn't caused by the municipality, but that was basically migrating through their lands. So I only raise these things, again, just to make potential buyers aware of the different sorts of liabilities these sites attract. And this is neither a positive nor a negative. These are things you need to bring, and you need to make sure you're doing the right due diligence and then properly managing those risks as you go through the transaction. Sorry, we're just going to get the slides. Okay, so then the next piece, once you're at the point where you've decided that you're ready to proceed with the transaction, or you feel comfortable, rather, with the risks that the site poses, then you want to start thinking about your redevelopment strategy. So again, going back to our example, what the potential buyer thought they could do was basically create a new industrial building on one side of the site and lease that back to the vendor. And that gave them a great opportunity for stable cash flow, which helped the deal. And then on the balance of the property, redevelop with some mid-rise office and retail, and then a few commercial retail stores. So again, as you're thinking about the redevelopment plan, when you have a contaminated property, if you're able to redevelop in a way that lets you tackle the risks, you're already spending money doing a certain amount of redevelopment work. So if you can have that money also go into actually doing the cleanup, you can sort of minimize your costs to tackle that property. And here's just a few questions that you might want to be asking yourself as you're going through that, evaluating that. One of the most important things is to try to get your redevelopment plan to maximize your cleanup opportunity. So in other words, if you're thinking about doing some underground parking, then maybe to the extent that you can, you want that underground parking in the area where you have the deepest source material that you would have to dig out, so that you're, once again, aligning the footprint of that underground parking with the footprint of the area of concern. You also want to think about your timeline. So how long will it take you from the moment you buy the property to basically go through the planning and approvals process at the municipality. How long will it take for you to undertake that cleanup? And how long will it take for construction? And again, the environmental piece plays into that because that will factor into the timeline and factor into a bunch of different things like your loan costs, the timing of when you can lease your properties or sell your properties. Again, all important factors to take into consideration. At this point, I am going to hand the microphone back to, my apologies. I'm sorry, we will continue on with insurance instruments that are available to help manage some of these risks. So as we talk about insurance and how insurance can help us manage some of the risks, keep going back to the example we raised before, I want to get down into 4 buckets, and we'll talk about each one here individually. So one of the challenges that brownfield sites, or at least individuals that are trying to manage brownfield sites, one of the challenges they raise all the time is the ability to get a construction or development loan. And I think what's important to remember is if a site is profitable, if a lender is confident that at the end of the day that site will result in a net profit, chances are the environmental aspects of the site will not play that significant a role in determining the loan, whether a loan is issued or not. Where environmental insurance can help is on sites that the P&L is perhaps not as strong or as certain. And so what I mean by that is, insurance is not going to help you make an unprofitable site suddenly become profitable. And insurance is not going to help you convince a lender that inadequate due diligence is suddenly adequate. But what we can do is help reduce financial uncertainty. So when a loan officer is doing perhaps a stress test on a given location, on a given loan scenario, they may decide to evaluate what would happen in the event that you uncover some unknown pollution condition. How does that impact your P&L, your cash flow during the course of redevelopment? If you're in a position where that type of risk is causing a loan officer some concern, by buying a pollution policy, what you're able to do is then demonstrate that in the event that you do find some new contamination, so if we go back to the original example, there were 3 areas of impact. If all of a sudden you find a 4th, perhaps there's some metals in the soils in the northwest corner of the property. Those new impacts would actually be covered by the policy, and the policy would pay for the cleanup of that area. And so what that does is it allows you to demonstrate to the loan officer that, hey, that money is not coming out of the developer's pocket. There's an insurance policy that will pay for that, and therefore that incident won't impact the financials of the deal. Something else that might be of concern is third-party liabilities that arise. So if you imagine a brownfield property that's been vacant for a number of years, and then all of a sudden, the hoarding and the fences go up all around that property, neighbors suddenly know that there is development, that there is potentially money now associated with that property. And actually, we do see a rise in claims or claim activity when the sites actively undergo development. So that may be another concern the loan officer has. Basically, how do you deal with any third-party claims that might come out of the woodwork once you start development? And again, this is where an insurance policy could be helpful in that we cover those third-party claims and we cover the defense costs. And ultimately, if there's any judgments awarded, we pay out those awards as well. So again, able to demonstrate to a loan officer that even if that event happens, you're not impacting the P&L of the redevelopment. So directors and officers' liability is another area of concern. So oftentimes, developers do not want to purchase contaminated property because they fear the liability that their D's and O's would then attract. And again, a classic example of that in Ontario is North Star, or you can look up Baker versus MOE. to get an example of how that plays out in real life here in Ontario. What an environmental policy allows you to do is, while the policy may not cover all elements of the known conditions on a contaminated property, so by that I mean day one, that policy might exclude cleanup of those 3 areas of impact on the property. What we are able to do is day one, we can give cover for those known contaminants to the directors and officers. And so if for some reason the site attracts attention from the MOE and the directors and officers of that development company are suddenly issued an order, the policy would respond with defense costs and even cleanup costs if it ultimately gets to that for those Ds and Os. Again, just another way of managing a risk that might prevent someone from looking at a brownfield property. Okay, third item on the list is really has to do with your indemnity obligations. So what environmental insurance can do is it can actually be used as an assurance vehicle. So if you're able to negotiate an indemnity from say the seller, again, what insurance is unable to do is we can't suddenly make a bad indemnity deal a good one, and we certainly can't make a bad indemnitor a good indemnitor. And what I mean by that is, if someone doesn't have the financial means to indemnify you, we can't suddenly step in and solve that problem. But on the assumption that you are able to negotiate a sound indemnity, what we can help with is by reducing the uncertainty around enforcing that indemnity. So if ultimately, 3 years down the road, you come into some sort of unforeseen event, and you feel you have to go back to the vendor and ask them to indemnify you, and that vendor refuses to do so for a variety of different reasons, the environmental insurance policy actually steps in and replaces the indemnitor and picks up those indemnity obligations. And then the insurance company is the one that then goes out and subrogates against the original indemnitor. So what you've done by placing an environmental insurance policy is remove the friction, remove the uncertainty around enforcing that indemnity. The other thing too is it gives you a little more confidence in that you've sort of shifted that obligation to another typically A+ rated carrier. So again, it gives you a little more certainty that when the day comes, there is someone there with the financial means to actually respond to the indemnity obligations. Okay, last piece I'll touch on is just really what I call exit strategy, or the sale process. So while environmental policies offer a great amount of risk management, risk transfer opportunities during the development stage, they're also very helpful on the back end after the site's been redeveloped and you're looking to potentially sell or lease. So by that I mean any future tenants that you put on the site. Those tenants may one day become sick or feel that they've been in some way hurt by basically being a tenant on a formerly contaminated site. In general, those future claims, should they come out of the woodwork, would be covered by an environmental policy, right? So again, protecting that the site owner. If at some point in the future government standards change, so today you opted to clean up the site to current standards, but 5 years from now those standards change and the government says, please go back and clean up the site again. Those reopeners would also be covered by the policy. And then the last piece is the policy can then, at the sale stage, the policy can actually act as a backstop to any indemnities that the policyholder has to provide to future buyers of the site. So you can just imagine, fast forward 7 years, you've cleaned up the property, you've redeveloped it, and now you're looking to sell it. you can sell the site and tell the potential buyer, look, not only did we clean up the site, got an RC or risk assessment that was approved by the ministry, but by the way, there's also an insurance policy behind here with 5 million, 10 million, 25 million of liability cover in the event of some future unforeseen event. And that policy, like I say, that can basically help backstop any indemnities that you want to provide to that next buyer. So with that, I am going to hand off now to John.
Thanks, Carl. That's some really good information there. The third topic of the four that we're going to be discussing is the quantification of liabilities using environmental site investigation. So we're going to talk about a couple things, but I see the goal in this quantification is to determine what's the cost. We're buying a piece of contaminated property. We want to clean it up and develop it. So what is the cost of that cleanup? Secondly, we want to be able to get some sort of quantification on what the legal liabilities are in purchasing that property. And then the timing. How long is it going to take from the day we buy that or purchase that property to the day where we can start building on it and the day we can start selling condos or renting out or whatever we're going to do on that particular property. That's really the end goal as I see it. So with respect to the quantification, one of the first things we want to do obviously is a phase one environmental site assessment. And one of the things, and this goes back to my days when I was at Torrey's, which was a law firm downtown Toronto, environmental law practice group, used to review quite a few phase one environmental site assessments, and that was kind of the Wild West days prior to the CSA standards. And so you'd have a mix of reports, but at the end of the day, we certainly more around environmental site assessments. They need to have a conclusion and a recommendation, and some still try to get away with not having a conclusion or recommendation. Carl's shaking his head because he agrees with me. Some of them try to get away from that, but at the end of the day, they have to have this if it's going to be a CSA standard or a RSC Reg 15304 regulated document, which the first paragraph of every report says they're either a CSA standard or a RSC Reg 15304. So that's going to be high, medium, or low probability of environmental contamination at the site, and then give you a recommendation that, yes, we need further investigation, there's some area of potential environmental concern or APEC, or no further investigation because the probability of contamination is low. For example, some agricultural field or some place out in Algonquin Park. Definitely, if someone's recommending a phase two out there, they better have a damn good reason. Which, if the recommendation is, yes, further investigation, that further investigation takes the form of a phase two environmental site assessment. And the two things that should come out of your phase two environmental site assessment is the confirmation or not that contaminants or contamination is or is not present on the property, and then some recommendation on next steps. Now, I've seen reports where they don't have the recommendation on next step, but it should have some recommendations on next steps. Most frequently, it would be the delineation of the extent of that contamination, because most consultants, at least the very good ones, would want to limit the cost of that phase two. So it's a bit of a balancing act. So they don't want to, what I call, and a lot of people call, Swiss cheesing the site, where you may have some consultants say, okay, every 5-10 meters we're going to put a borehole and a groundwater monitoring well. Well, a one that's more cognizant and aware of the costs would do it phase two more in a stepwise fashion, where they would try to balance the locations of those boreholes and installation of ground monitoring wells with where the areas are. If you cast your mind back to Carl's example, there are 3 areas of potential environmental concern. So the boreholes would definitely be in those 3 locations, but the northwest corner, it was clean. So consultant wanting to make money would say, hey, everywhere, we need to put it everywhere, whereas the one that doesn't want to fund their child's braces out of it would be more aware of spending the money. But anyway, so we'll come out with a delineation extent of the contamination. It'll be a stepwise approach, and then discuss some of the options on the contamination, a budget for cleanup of those options, and then a timeline for cleanup. That's, to me, a good consultant on what a phase 2 should look like with respect to conclusion and recommendations. Now, if you want to get involved in this space, and I've talked to people, they say, oh, I don't want to stay away from them. For me, I don't have that. I have a risk aversion to contaminated properties. I've heard the horror stories of people going to jail or people losing their shirts, etc. But there's also those other stories where people, and you see that like in the home and garden channels, where they buy a fixer-upper at a bargain price, they fix it up, they sell it, they make a really tidy profit. And there are companies, and finance companies, developers, etc., that's what their specialty is, and they've done very good work, and they've been profitable. So if you are interested in doing this, or you are sharing with us, to me, I've categorized this particular slide into the good, the bad, and the ugly, just like the movie, of contaminated properties that you would consider buying, and really the good, the bad, and the ugly is to your level of risk. Okay, it's like 1 meter, 3 meter, 10 meter diving board and swimming pool, the good, bad, and ugly. So if you want to say, hey, I do want to get into this contaminated site property redevelopment, maybe it would be a good site. To me, I call a good site something where you're using petroleum hydrocarbons. We have petroleum hydrocarbon contamination for years, fairly well understood in the environmental consulting community. Inorganic contaminants, for example, metals, another very well understood, and plus metals generally don't migrate off-site, so they tend to be in place. So you're looking at a site where the contamination is in the soil, hasn't made it to the groundwater, and there's clear indication that there's no off-site migration. To me, that's what I could call a good contaminated site. You might get it at a good price, and then you factor in what you could potentially build on that site, then you could turn a tidy profit with minimal risk. Then I get into the bad contaminated sites for redevelopment, and those are the sites with some more complex contaminants, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, some of the higher chain petroleum hydrocarbons, for example, lube oils and tars, and then volatile organic compounds, which can lead to a situation where you get possible vapor intrusion into neighboring properties. The contamination is both in the soil and the groundwater, so you have 2 media that you need to address. But a bad site, to me, has those problems, but is no off-site migration. So certainly greater risk. There's more complex contaminants that need to be addressed, and you have 2 media. And then these ugly contaminated sites, and this is for maybe people on that list, I'm not sure. And I've seen one. I actually saw a site just before Christmas, one of these ugly contaminated sites where you get these dense non-aqueous phase liquids, which is dry cleaning solvent. Most people run away as fast as they could when they find out there's dry cleaning solvent on a site. And that particular site I saw was a former dry cleaner looking to sell. It was strong indication that it had gone off-site. The dry cleaning fluids, the concentration in the groundwater monitoring wells were so high that you could skim off the dry cleaning fluid and use it again. That's how high the concentrations were. It was definitely in the soil and in the groundwater. And then you also have the added concern of this vapor intrusion into buildings an off-site building. So that to me is the ugly site where you're taking on the property, a major cleanup. Depending on who you talk to, Dean Apples, or everyone will agree they're extremely hard to remediate. And some people would say it's impossible. So that's one of those that I'm not sure who is brave enough to do that, to take on that sort of property. But that's where you really need to know. You really need the insurance. You really need to delineate the site. You really need to probably do something with the neighbors before you're going to take ownership of that particular property. With respect to quantification of the liability and then the confirmed contamination. So you've done the phase 2, you confirm contamination. I just talked, this is a brief slide on the options on how to address that contamination. There's over 30 methods or technologies. You can go on a US EPA website, they have a whole bunch listed there. But in Ontario, from my experience, there's the most prevalent ones are these 4 that I have listed, the dig and dump. And developers love dig and dump. It's fairly cheap. I used to actually work for a company that specialized in remediation of soils, ex situ remediation. And the cost of a dig and dump, you're looking at anywhere from how well your negotiating skills are, from anywhere from $45 to $75 per ton trucking and disposal. And the great thing of dig and dump is the problem's removed. There's contamination in the soil. You're removing all the soil. Insto, presto, very quick. It's the amount of time it takes to dig it up. And you're usually digging up that site anyway if it's a major development and you're going to have underground parking. So it's really the difference between sending the soil to an excess fill site, which is somewhere between $2 and $10 a ton, to sending the soil to a contaminated site treatment facility or a landfill, which is, like I said, anywhere from $50, $75 a ton. The second approach is the natural temperature approach. It's more than nothing. I don't want to get into a lot of details on it, but it is an approach where you're monitoring nature and you're making sure the contamination is off-site. Key to natural attenuation is time. And Carl's example is a good example because the industry was staying on site, potentially, as long as you're monitoring the contamination, it could potentially stay in place if all the parties agree. Third is in situ remediation. You generally see that if there's groundwater contamination. You have a pump and treat system. You'll see some gas stations actually in the GTA if you've got a Hawkeye. You'll see a little garage off the side of the property, and that houses the pump and treat system for the gas station. It's preventing any off-site contamination and it's remediating the groundwater. And then the fourth is risk assessment. And I remember back in 2004 when the RC regulation came out, a few people, or more than a few, said, "Oh, it's never work. You'll never sell a property on a risk assessment because no one's going to buy a property with the full knowledge that it's contaminated or with it on title." And they were proven wrong. I don't know where they are. They're like the people that phone into sports shows. They never get held to account, right? When they predict the colossal failure or success of someone, they never get held to account. Similarly, those critics of risk assessment. Risk assessment has proven to be very successful in this province. And there's any number of examples of properties where there's risk assessments, where there's on title that the property is contaminated, and there's no problem selling that properties and people renting and buying condos on those properties and it on title. It's just a matter of educating those particular buyers. A great point on risk assessment properties. Perhaps you can get at a better price, and you're not spending all that time on contamination. But it certainly is, in my mind, a great use of environmental insurances, because some people are a little worried about leaving contamination on a property. I have here on this slide some ballpark numbers. So, hey, you want to get in this space, this is so that you don't have a clue. It's not a million, it's not the dollar, right? So these are ballpark numbers. So I don't want people sending in questions and answers or calling me out that these numbers are right or wrong. I have a picture of a ballpark, literally. It's not contaminated. But if you're looking at natural attenuation, the monitoring costs are in the range of $5,000 to $10,000. That's what you're starting at. They can dump, like I said, $55 to $75 per ton. In situ remediation, very dependent on the site, the amount of contamination, etc. I know there's a Dean Apple site in Waterloo. They've been doing pump and treat there for the last 10, 15 years. So certainly a costly remediation, but some can be done in a matter of months. And then fourthly, risk assessment. The screening level, which is the generic ones that you can do with the Ministry of Environment, they're starting around 35. When you get into the full risk assessments, where you're using toxicologists, and you have your toxicologist, the Ministry have their toxicologist, and they're talking a language no one knows about, and there's rounds of discussion back and forth, you're starting at least 50,000, if not more. And you're looking at probably a year for that whole risk assessment to be performed, and the levels of review in the back and forth. So those are what I call the ballpark costs. Now, in our last 10 minutes of our discussion, I got one more slide, then we're going to get into some examples. And this is the record of site condition, which a lot of people consider the gold standard. You get a record of site condition, which most municipalities require, then it basically telling you, or most people, that the property is cleaned up, and then you can move ahead with the next hurdle with respect to developing the property. And there's just some costs and some timing issues around that in this particular slide. So we're going to get into some examples of where either environmental insurance, Carl is a very good example, and I just have one brief example of where the use of environmental site assessments are useful. So this is a slide on the use of insurance, so I'm going to hand it over to Carl.
Thank you, John. So going back to the site that we started with, the example, this is the policy that we put in place for that property. So basically it was a $10 million limit with a $250,000 self-insured retention. And what that means, it's insurance lingo, but what that means is in the event the policy is triggered, the first $250,000 is paid by the insured, and then any additional costs beyond that, up to $10 million, are covered by the insurance company. And this policy had a 10-year term. And that term was important because basically it was going to take at least 2 or 3 years to get through the planning and approval process, the cleanup process, and the development process. Even with a 5-year term mortgage, it was important to both the lenders and the buyer that they have a long enough period after cleanup and after redevelopment to make some decisions on what the exit strategy would look like. And so that 10-year term was of importance to them, to lots of flexibility on that exit strategy. Day one, that policy did exclude the on-site cleanup of the 3 known issues, so that fill material, the tank impacts, and the VOC plume. But we were able to get to a point where there were no off-site exclusions. And again, this was important because of the VOC plume. What the buyer was concerned about was if that plume did migrate off-site, the potential third-party claims. So what we did there is we actually raised the self-insured retention to $500,000 with respect to that one specific item. And that provided enough confidence to the buyer. They could basically say, look, our downside is capped to $500,000. And then we have $10 million of insurance limit available in the event we get dragged into a really bad third-party claim. Now that policy cost approximately $570,000, which is not, it's a significant amount of money. But if you think about that over the 10-year term, it basically added about $57,000 a year to that particular site's pro forma P&L, whatever rationale you're using. Which, at least to this particular insured, made a lot of sense in terms of the different risks that the policy was picking up. So very quickly, I'll run through some of the benefits that insured realized by placing that policy. So one, we talked about this before, but During the course of redevelopment, had they encountered any other pollution, the policy would have paid for the cleanup of that additional pollution. So again, helped minimize the financial risk associated with development. It did provide legal defense in case the neighbors elected to pursue the new buyer. And again, all these benefits, basically accrued day one. The D's and O's of the purchasing entity. So while the purchasing entity, and this is pretty typical in real estate transaction, was sort of a limited liability corporation, there's always a general partnership that basically has to be involved when you create LLCs. And those general partnerships, while they might own a very insignificant portion of the property, a lot of liability attaches to them. And so this allowed those D's and O's, it gave them confidence knowing that should something happen, not only is their own company stepping in to protect them, but there's also an insurance policy, again, behind the scenes that cover them. Another important element was the vendor was going to become a tenant, and that tenant was basically going to occupy a portion of the site. And what the buyer was concerned about were claims from that tenant down the road. And again, the policy day one was able to cover things like business interruption claims that tenant might make, bodily injury claims for any of their employees getting sick. All of that was again covered by the policy day one. And then in terms of the exit strategy, once the site is fully cleaned up and they obtain that RSC or the risk assessment is approved, we actually go back into that policy and we're able to delete the original exclusions. So what that does, as we talked about a little earlier, it provides cover in the event of something going wrong. Maybe we didn't clean up all of the areas of impact. Maybe the standards change at some point down the road. Whatever reason creates a requirement to revisit that original cleanup, the policy is now paying. Once those exclusions are deleted, the policy is now paying for that next level of cleanup if and when required. So again, just very quickly trying to demonstrate the value of that policy day one and long term on the exit strategy. Last thing I'll leave the group with is, look, very, very important to engage underwriting early. The earlier you get us involved in the deal, the more helpful we can be. And that can be through your insurance agent or your broker. Just get in touch with an underwriter, call them up, get them involved in the deal early. In terms of what we might ask, we will ask you to disclose documents. We will want to discuss your redevelopment strategy. From that, we can issue indications or quotes. Pretty much every carrier will have an application that you'll need to fill out. And then at that point, it's up to the insured as to when they want to bind, which means to purchase the policy. Some like to do that prior to closing. Others like to do that on the deal day. I think at this point, we're going to get into some examples of using environmental site assessments, so I will pass this back to John.
Thanks, Carl. That was a great example, too. I just have one example, because we're almost at 1 o'clock, and it's the example of the use of environmental site assessment on a particular property that was contaminated, and the owner wanted to redevelop that property, had some legacy contamination from a historic commercial use of a neighboring property. What we did at Alltech was basically recommended and oversaw a dig and dump, and combined with the use of natural attenuation, monitoring of the groundwater, and that took approximately 3 to 4 months for natural attenuation to occur after the source of contamination, which was from the soil, was removed. We completed the RSC after a couple of rounds of review and discussions with the ministry. The total cost, including cleanup and all consulting costs, including the filing their record site condition, was $75,000. The owner was able to redevelop the site, and the payback period was only a few years. So that's a simple example of an issue if you are going to get into the brownfields redevelopment or buying brownfield. That's fairly simple. So that is, we're right at 1 o'clock. That concludes our formal presentation. So on with the advertising. Those are all the handsome and good-looking people that work at Berkeley, Canada. Talk to anyone, starting with Carl. And then our little all-tech piece. We're not as handsome-looking, so we don't have any pictures. We don't have any pictures. If you're interested in talking offline to either Carl or myself, you can certainly send us an email. If you are interested in a copy of these slides, or we're recording this podcast, we will be sharing that through Felicia, who's the superstar organizer of this event. And then finally, we are going to have another event probably a month and a half from now. So stay tuned. Make sure you're on our mailing list to hear about that. So have a great afternoon, and have a great March when it comes tomorrow. Thanks for participating, everybody.